particularly the state governments who could tax, were taxing what many people thought were unfairly, or taxing their people unfairly. And so that created a lot of excitement and a lot of negativity, negative behaviors in the colonies. People stopped trusting their states as much as they did when they first ended the war. This led to an issue that we're going to watch a video on called Shays' Rebellion, which was really the issue that showed us that this government wasn't going to work. Shays' Rebellion was the issue. It was a rebellion of farmers who were overtaxed in Massachusetts. And they rose up because they were asked to pay back from their debt, and they could not. And they had their land taken, and they were incredibly upset. They were led by a guy who actually fought in the Revolutionary War named Daniel Shays. And he rose up, and he showed that if this revolution spread beyond Massachusetts, the national government wasn't adequate in order to fight it off. The national government wasn't going to be able to stop this from happening. So they realized quickly after this is that something had to change with the government. And that was how you saw that's what made the life of the Articles of Confederation so short. So we're going to watch here a quick video on the Articles of Confederation.
All around him, Daniel Shays saw poor farmers like himself, many of whom he had served with in the Revolutionary War, now being sent to rot in debtors' prisons. Families were left without providers, and mothers were forced to beg in the streets.
He'd been taken to court for debts twice by different retailers. So Daniel Shays was afraid that he was going to lose his land, he was going to lose his crops, lose his cows, and so on, and he couldn't support his family at that point.
To lose your farm and to have to work for someone else was more than just an economic decline. It was a decline in your status in your country. That is, you would no longer be a voter. In order to vote in most colonies and in most states, you had to prove that you owned land. This made you an independent man.
And here you have an interesting situation of the complete insensitivity, the blindness of a political elite. The political elite that governed Massachusetts were for the most part centered in eastern Massachusetts. They were oriented towards the sea, towards commerce, towards business. And indeed, there was a wide cultural, economic, and geographic gap between eastern Massachusetts and the western part of the colony.
Shays began to meet frequently with his supporters at Conkey's Tavern, inciting them with talk of self-government and rebellion.
It had been a tradition for decades and decades, maybe centuries, to have demonstrations by the people when they felt that there was some economic inequity or some invasion of people's rights as citizens by people in power. Shays' Rebellion, in a sense, comes out of that tradition.
Shays had convinced his fellow farmers that something had to change. During the summer of 1786, all over western Massachusetts, conventions were held to determine a list of demands that were to be delivered to state government leaders in Boston. Because Boston was both the center of industry and also the major port, the state government was largely composed of wealthy lawyers, merchants, and property owners.
The Eastern establishment turned a deaf ear. There were protests. The rebellion that erupts in 1786 and 87 did not come as a great surprise. There had been lots of little bits of evidence and suggestions that the people of the West were unhappy, but the Eastern establishment ignored them, and they went ahead with their program of taxation. That is, taxation to raise the money, to pay the state debt, and to make the necessary contributions to national government. In the meantime, ignoring this rising chorus that was coming up of the more rural periods of Massachusetts.
As a prominent figure in the Eastern establishment, Samuel Adams had vowed to stay out of politics after the Revolution. But the temptation was too much, and he eventually ran for the state senate. He won, and was soon elected Senate President. One of his first acts was to call for an end to the county convention.
County conventions are not only useless, but dangerous. They served an excellent purpose and were highly necessary when they were set up, but no more.
The irony of Samuel Samuel Adams' career after the American Revolution is that the very techniques that he pioneered, the very strategies that he developed, the very tactics that he employed were now going to be used by, one might almost say, his students. His students being now the farmers in western and central Massachusetts. They began to organize meetings of protests in county conventions, in town meetings, all kinds of activities that mirrored exactly what Samuel Adams had been doing in the 1770s. The difference now is that Samuel Adams, the great agitator of the 1770s, the great organizer of resistance, now in the 1780s, looks upon these people in resistance and is horrified. Absolutely horrified. It can never be the duty of one man to be concerned in more than one revolution.
But Daniel Shays and the farmers of western Massachusetts didn't agree. They were indeed concerning themselves with the Second Rebellion. They had tried to wave conventions, petitions, and letters to their elected leaders. They had tried to seek justice legally, and they had been ignored.
They viewed lawyers and they viewed judges in the same way as they viewed the Eastern politicians. These were men out to suck their blood.
Shays still had no way to pay his debts to the businessmen of eastern Massachusetts, and was faced with the threat of imprisonment, crushing poverty, and the loss of his farm. To feed his family, he had been forced to sell his most cherished belonging, the sword he had received from the Marquis de Lafayette. Fortunately, Daniel Shays still had one sword left, the cutlass he had carried in the Battle of Bunker Hill. And now he sharpened it again in preparation for a new battle. In the late fall of 1786, Daniel Shays began to muster and train an army. Among them were many of the men he had fought with in the Revolution.
The Massachusetts veterans of the Revolution who joined Shays' Rebellion put the hemlock in their hat when they went off to war to fight against British tyranny. I mean, it was symbolic. This is the new tyranny that they're fighting against.
The poor and oppressed in Massachusetts had desperately needed a leader. Now they had one, Daniel Shays.
There's an interesting irony there that they're basically back almost in the exact same situation they were in prior to. They had a new government. It lasted for several years. Economic turmoil happened again. People were, accordingly to some people, not treated fairly. And so what they did is what they knew. They rose up, they spoke, they used their freedoms that they took so to heart. And they did exactly what they did before, but the difference is they were now rising up and now against themselves. You see Samuel Adams was a major Revolutionary War leader. And here he is on the other side of the battle. So Shays' Rebellion happens in Massachusetts, but the news of Shays' Rebellion spreads all over the nation. And what that really helped national leaders understand is that what they're doing isn't working. So they recognize now that this government had failed, and that the government wasn't going to keep things intact. The national government wasn't strong enough, wasn't secure enough to not only prevent measures like Shays' Rebellion from happening, but it wasn't secure enough to fight against it either. And so what they did is they called for a meeting in Annapolis, Maryland. And that's what you're seeing right here. And they called that meeting to discuss ways, and I want to really highlight the word change, to change the Articles of Confederation. That meeting was really not well attended. Only 12 delegates from 5 states came. That meeting was, just like the Articles, a failure. So they called for another meeting, and they didn't want just the Confederation Congress to come to this meeting. Rather, they called for more leaders of the United States to come, and this is where they had the Constitutional Convention, and that's in 1787. They called the Constitutional Convention to discuss changes again to the Articles of Confederation. So they called one meeting. That meeting didn't work. They called a larger, meeting of more leaders from more states, and that meeting did actually happen in 1787, and that's where the Constitution was created. But I really want to make sure we understand that the goal of that meeting to begin with was not to write the Constitution. The goal there was to revise, and that's to revise the Articles of Confederation. The colonists at the Constitutional Convention, not colonists, excuse me, the Americans wanted to keep the Confederation. They liked the idea of the Confederation, but they wanted to make it better. So they go, but the more and more changes they start to recommend, the more and more they realize that just changing it might not work. And that's where the Constitution was created. And that, you'll see, is what we're going to get to after this presentation, is the actual creation of the Constitution. Once they realize that revisions were going to be too much or too lengthy, maybe it'll be easier just to start over with a new document. And so that's where you see us go from the Revolutionary War, the Declaration of Independence, to creating our Confederation government, being under the Articles of Confederation. We watched that government not succeed, and then we learned quickly that in order to prevent rebellion from all over the nation, we realized that we need to revise the Articles of Confederation, and we called the Constitutional Convention. What I want you guys to do in your papers, though, is to make sure you really understand why the Articles were so weak. Why were they a problem? Because what we're going to do after this presentation is understand the solutions that the Constitution created as a response to the problems in the Articles of Confederation. Thanks, guys.